Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today we will discuss Kamala Harris's recent interview, Trump backing out of an interview, hurricane conspiracy theories from the GOP, and Bob Woodward's allegations about Trump and Putin, along with much more. With that out of the way, let's get into the show. On Monday, Harris went on 60 Minutes with correspondent Bill Whitaker. Throughout the interview, Harris went over issues related to the economy, gun ownership, and the ongoing war in the Middle East, as well as immigration. While it was not a perfect interview, it was still a strong sign of her willingness to engage with the issues compared to her opponent. At one point, CBS's Bill Whitaker asked Harris how she would pay for her economic agenda, and while her answer was not perfect, she did hit on the dangers of tax cuts that make it hard for our government to pay for anything.
Harris says she'll press Congress to pass a federal ban on price gouging for food and groceries, but details are yet to be defined.
You want to expand the child tax credit.
Yes, I do.
You want to give tax breaks to first-time home buyers.
Yes.
And people starting small businesses.
Correct.
But it is estimated by the Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget that your economic plan would add $3 trillion to the federal deficit over the next decade. How are you going to pay for that?
Okay, so the other economists that have reviewed my plan versus my opponent and determined that my economic plan would strengthen America's economy, his would weaken it.
But
my plan, Bill, if you don't mind, my plan is about saying that when you invest in small businesses, you invest in the middle class, and you strengthen America's economy. Small businesses are part of the backbone of America's economy.
But pardon me, Madam Vice President, the question was, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, one of the things is I'm going to make sure that the richest among us who can afford it pay their fair share in taxes. It is not right that teachers and nurses and firefighters are paying a higher tax rate than billionaires and the biggest corporations. And I plan on making that fair.
But we're dealing with the real world here.
But the real world includes...
How are you going to get this through Congress?
You know, when you talk quietly with a lot of folks in Congress, they know exactly what I'm talking about because their constituents know exactly what I'm talking about. Their constituents are those firefighters and teachers and nurses. Their constituents are middle-class, hardworking folk.
And Congress has shown no inclination to move in your direction.
I disagree with you. There are plenty of leaders in Congress who understand and know that the Trump tax cuts blew up our federal deficit. None of us, and certainly I cannot afford to be myopic in terms of how I think about strengthening America's economy. Let me tell you something. I am a devout public servant, you know that. I am also a capitalist. And I know the limitations of government.
I will note that while this segment was not the strongest, and I have repeated this several times throughout this segment, I do think Harris correctly pointed out that when in power, options in Congress come forward. It isn't always easy to see where Congress's mood will be simply because there's an election season going on. Whether or not Bill Whitaker likes it, there is a limitation as to how much a candidate can promise. In another segment, Harris also noted that Ukrainian success requires Ukrainian voices to be heard and simultaneously hit Trump over his lackluster policy on Ukraine.
I thank you all.
Whoever wins the presidency will take on a host of daunting challenges, especially beyond our borders. Back in Washington, Vice President Harris told us she's determined the U.S. must win the economic competition with China for the 21st century. And as for the war between Russia and Ukraine?
What does success look like in ending the war in Ukraine?
There will be no success in ending that war without Ukraine and the UN Charter participating in what that success looks like.
Would you meet with President Vladimir Putin to negotiate a solution to the war in Ukraine?
Not bilaterally without Ukraine, no. Ukraine must have a say in the future of Ukraine.
As president, would you support the effort to expand NATO to include Ukraine?
Those are all issues that we will deal with if and when it arrives at that point. Right now, we are supporting Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia's unprovoked aggression. Donald Trump, if he were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. He talks about, oh, he can end it on day one. You know what that is? It's about surrender.
I'm particularly fond of this answer because not only does it allow for flexible policy to respond as needed to help Ukraine defend itself, but it makes clear that Donald Trump is not fit to handle the Russo-Ukrainian war. Ukraine did not start this war. Russia did. And if Putin is permitted to wage his war of aggression with impunity, not only is Ukraine in trouble, but the reputation and well-being of the United States will also suffer. The stability of the world would suffer severely if Russia were to take Ukraine, as it would now be next to a NATO country in Poland. It is especially important to defend Ukrainian sovereignty, not just to avoid a larger war, but to ensure Russian aggression can't continue unchecked. Trump doesn't have a proper response to this kind of aggression because he's a useless contrarian. He is always interested in undermining what he sees as the established thinking, even if he has no reason to do so. And I'm very pleased to see that Harris has made that point in this interview. While she could have done better in some areas, I am excited to see Harris taking up this interview along with many others. Speaking of interviews, for our next story, we turn to Donald Trump and his relationship with 60 Minutes. As many of you know, the former president was going to participate in an interview with CBS, but at the last minute pulled out. However, recently, CBS did a breakdown for all the reasons that Donald Trump's campaign gave them and how it looks increasingly like the former president was worried he would look bad. Here is that breakdown.
The campaign offered shifting explanations. First, it complained that we would fact-check the interview. We fact-check every story. Later, Trump said he needed an apology for his interview in 2020. Trump claims correspondent Leslie Stahl said in that interview that Hunter Biden's controversial laptop came from Russia. She never said that. Trump has said his opponent doesn't do interviews because she can't handle them. He had previously declined another debate with Harris, so tonight may have been the largest audience for the candidates between now and Election Day. Our questions addressed the economy, immigration, reproductive rights, and the wars in the Middle East and Europe. Both campaigns understood this special would go ahead if either candidate backed out. And so, with that, here's Bill Whitaker.
The fact that Donald Trump had to make up reasons not to participate in the interview, all while refusing to debate Vice President Harris and claim she can't do an interview, is ridiculous. It is cowardly and low. It does absolutely nothing to show Donald Trump's strength, his policies, or his qualifications to be president again. His unwillingness to sit down and discuss key issues is an indictment on his campaign. While it remains unclear if the former president will open up to more mainstream news, it is unlikely that we will see any serious attempt by Trump to engage in an honest interview. But that's not surprising. For our next story, we turn to hurricane conspiracy theories. As many of you remember from my last podcast, I went over Hurricane Helene and its impact on the local population. Since then, however, Trump and his allies have continued to engage in conspiracy theories that not only put people at risk, but make the issue of how to respond to Hurricane Milton even more difficult. Last Friday, Donald Trump alleged that $1 billion were stolen from FEMA to help migrants. In response, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell has called out these claims for the dangerous lies they are, saying, quote, "This level of misinformation creates the scenario where they won't even come to us," unquote. It's also worth noting that it isn't true at all that the FEMA budget for migrants has anything to do with disaster relief. It's an entirely separate fund. And if Trump really was interested in making sure these people had what they need to survive, he would be calling on his Republican allies in the House of Representatives to call an emergency session to add additional funding. It's also worth noting, and I know this isn't going to be very popular with some people on the right, but FEMA is not out of money. While FEMA has gone through budget deficits in the past, Congress can always up their budget, something that Trump is not even willing to acknowledge. But he is not alone in spreading these lies. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, somebody who could be pushing for an emergency session or do anything that a normal person would do in this environment, is now insisting that Democrats control the weather. Yes, you heard that right. You heard that absolutely right. A sitting member of Congress, who is very likely to be reelected, is claiming somehow an unknown group of Democrats are controlling the weather. This is where we are at, ladies and gentlemen. At a time when hundreds of people are dead and more are dying, these people are taking advantage of this tragedy for their own ends. So if there's one thing I can emphasize, it is that nobody, and I mean nobody, should be listening to these people. If you are in an area that is impacted by this hurricane, please listen to government officials. They will help you. Seek out any and all assistance they can provide to you because they will do everything they can to keep you safe. Regardless of your party affiliation, you deserve to live safely without people like Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene taking advantage of your situation and leaving you to rot with misinformation. You all deserve better. For our final story, we turn to the author Bob Woodward. Recently, the acclaimed author revealed in his upcoming book, War, that Donald Trump was sending COVID-19 tests to Putin when America was suffering a shortage, and that as many as 7 private phone calls have occurred between the two after Trump left office in 2021. Now, Woodward has a habit of unfortunately withholding important information until the last minute before his books are published. That is a serious reason for concern. But more concerning is that Donald Trump could have been outed in committing yet another crime. Under the Logan Act, it is illegal for an American to engage in diplomacy with foreign countries without authorization from the federal government. If Trump did call Putin without authorization, he could very well be facing charges if additional evidence is provided. I should also note that Trump and his campaign deny these claims and claim that this is retribution by Woodward for a lawsuit they filed against him for his previous book titled Fear. However, that lawsuit has not been finalized in court yet. Still, it's bad enough that Trump is weak on key issues regarding Ukraine and Russia, but it would be even worse that one of the most powerful men in the Republican Party could be corrupted and guided by a rival power. It is unacceptable, but we will just have to wait and see what comes of this story. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Progressive American. If you would like to check out my other work, you can go around on my YouTube channel at The Progressive American, or you can check out my newsletter at theprogressiveamerican.com. Thanks again for listening and have a wonderful day.